In a relationship, when is honesty not the best policy? How do you balance what you want versus what you need? And is there something you need to say to your spouse, but can't find the right way to say it? If so, then you're in the right place. This is the Lunch with Sandy podcast. With nearly 20 years of marriage under their belts, Terrence and Sandy Jackson discuss a range of topics, provide valuable insights on relationships, and talk about the conversations married couples need to have. So what does lunch have to do with all of this? Well, it's a metaphor for how these conversations originally started. Speaking of conversations, let's get one going. Here's your hosts, Terrence and Sandy.
Welcome to another episode of the Lunch with Sandy podcast, where we delve into various topics and offer perspective from two individuals who've been married for a very, very long time. As always, I'm Terrence.
And I'm Sandy.
And today we're going to be having a discussion about whether or not it is okay to lie to your kids.
I do it all the time.
I know you do. But before we get into that, two things we need to get out of the way. One, be sure to follow and leave feedback on your favorite podcasting app. And second, we got to get to the area or the part of the episode that we do at the beginning of every episode, and it's answering the burning question. Sandy, how's Sandy doing today?
I'm actually kind of full. I just got back from brunch with friends, so
I would call it lunch because you left. It was 11:30. I think that qualifies as lunch by the time you got there.
it was their brunch menu.
Well,
so,
it can be.
And I had breakfast food, so hence brunch.
Well, you know what? There's something I want to bring into the light. You just mentioned something that I wasn't going to talk about, but I'm going to talk about it now. Listen, if it's between 11:30 and 1 o'clock, that's lunch. Bring your lunch menu out. I went to a place a few weeks back, and we got there at 1 o'clock, and all we can order from was the brunch menu. I don't want brunch.
Well,
if I wanted brunch, I would have had brunch earlier between that 10:30 and 11:30
everybody wakes
spot.
up at 4 o'clock in the morning like you. Some people like to
It
have
was 1
brunch.
o'clock in the afternoon, not 1 a.m.
So some people might be just waking up at 1 o'clock, and hence
That's your breakfast.
hence brunch.
Yeah.
Breakfast.
Anyway, for all you
For
places out there serving brunch, it's between the hours of 10, 10:30, and let's say I'll
2.
give you till noon.
10
And if
2.
you're going to serve brunch until 2, give people the option of actually choosing from the lunch menu. I don't care if you serve food until 5 o'clock, but you can't tell someone you can't order from our lunch menu because today it's only brunch.
Well, the brunch is mixed. It has breakfast and lunch options.
No, not this place. It didn't have lunch
well.
options. You could only order from the brunch menu, and you couldn't make any substitutions.
And their brunch was technically breakfast, is what it sounds like.
No, listen. Don't give me a brunch menu and tell me that's all I can order from. I want the lunch menu at 1 o'clock. Anyway, I'm digressing. Sandy's sitting here got me talking about brunch and lunch. And she wants me to gloss over the fact that she lies to her kids all the time. Today, we're going to speak about the truth. And the truth is, if you haven't done it already, at some point, you are going to lie to your kids. Now, there's probably a reason why you do it. And hopefully, it's a good reason.
Not just for the fun of it.
But not just for the fun of it, but it will happen. So let's talk about why it happens. You ready for this?
Mm-hmm.
There are certain instances or certain type of lies that, let's be honest, you're going to tell to your kids. And they tend to fall in certain categories. Sometimes, you tell those lies that are for entertainment purposes, right? Mm-hmm. And when I say entertainment purposes, there are a couple of things that can fall under there. Like you start looking at that fantasy realm, the magic of being. A perfect example is, unfortunately, I'm going to have to say this, and listen, this is spoiler alert. If you got kids in the room, you probably want to have them leave right now. Santa Claus.
Yes.
That's one of the lies that I think a large number of parents, and I don't want to call it a lie.
Well, it's not even the parents that have to start that. to be honest. That's the other bad part about it, right?
Well,
like,
it's not about start. I'm not talking about starting it.
No, I know. But I mean, like, you know, parents, in some ways, it's not always them actually doing the lying to the children. It's they have to then keep up the lie.
Who's lying to your kid before you are?
They're watching TV, whatever it is, and then this idea of Santa Claus and Easter Bunny and
here's where the
Tooth
lie
Fairy,
comes in.
You know,
When you're watching TV, it's the magic of TV, and not everything on TV is true. So when they approach you and say, "Hey, listen,"
yeah,
they start talking about these things. You got a choice. You can tell them the truth, or you can lie to them. Kid loses a tooth. Right? And their expectation is they're going to take that tooth, they're going to put it under the pillow. Mm-hmm. Next day, they're going to expect a gold coin or whatever it is, whatever, monetary means you have and wherever you are, they're going to expect something.
You're right. Does
So
it make you a bad parent? Though?
No, I'm not saying that it makes you.
We'll get into straight out.
We'll get into whether or
as
not there's a lasting, long-term and short-term impact. But those are types of things that you actually lie to your kids. And I'm going to say lie, but when I'm talking about it, what I really mean is those are a few of the things that you mask over the truth when you're speaking to your kids about those things. And part of it is part of that whole entertainment purpose. And let me rephrase that. Some of it has to do with entertainment, but some of it is you want that magical experience for your kids. And part of it is believing in these things that may or may not be real.
Right. I feel like some parents do it because they think it's a form of like innocence almost. As long as your kids still believe in these things, your child is still an innocent little being.
There are going to be times where you're going to lie to your kid. For instance, we talked about Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy. But let's say, for instance, you're throwing a party for your kid and it's a surprise party.
Yeah.
Now you got to give them a reason why you're doing certain things or going a certain place. You're not going to tell them the truth.
Right.
You're probably going to lie to them. Now, those things you talked about there are certain reasons why some parents will want to do those things. Like when you start talking to kids and having them believe in things like the Tooth Fairy, Santa Claus, and they see these things on TV and they see all these different, whether it be in advertisements outside. But I do think that does foster some sense of creativity from the perspective of this is something that the way it's presented is creative. And once they see that, it starts to get them to think about these different, I don't want to call them fantasies, but I'm going to call them fantasies,
right,
which starts to spark things in their brain and gets those creative juices flowing.
Yeah, no, I just meant from the perspective from an entertainment perspective versus I feel like it's also sometimes just promoting a sense of innocence with your child.
Oh, no,
of why you're doing it versus
Well, some parents do it for other reasons too. When you start talking about Santa Claus and they hear that naughty and nice list, right, you want to get your kid to behave.
Yep.
You're going to tell them, listen, Santa Claus is real. You don't want to be on that naughty list.
Right?
Yes. And if it ain't him, it's the elf on the shelf. I also think that when kids believe in things like that, it instills a sense of adventure in them. And what I mean by that is I'm not just talking about, the Santa Claus and things like that. But when you start watching, when you're young, you see these, and I don't know how much TV kids are watching now, but at the young age, they start watching all these different adventures and things like that we know is not real, but they don't know that.
Right.
But at the same time, again, it gives them, it gives them the opportunity to start exploring different things, whether it be critically, thinking about things in their mind or just from the perspective of, going outside and being adventurous and playing and all those kinds of things. Yep. I think that can be good for the child.
Oh, definitely. Creativity is always good.
Well, yeah, I mean, listen.
For starters.
In doses, with everything, it's all about.
Well, that reminds
me. It's all about levels.
What about make-believe friends?
Again, that's one of those areas where,
right,
from the perspective of having that sense of adventure, having that ability to think and create, I think that's all part of it. I think that, again, when we talk about these things, it's important to consider, the development and the age of your child. But
Yeah.
in many cases, it's normal.
No, yeah, I'm pretty sure Ayla had one. She grew out of it. But she had an imaginary friend for a while.
Yeah. The other situation where I think that parents, and I'm not going to say whether or not it's okay or not okay. I'm going to say it's okay. I just said it because I wasn't going to say that. But sometimes you lie to your kids to protect them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether it be because of loss,
Yep.
whether it be because of illness, whether, the family is going through something like maybe a separation or divorce or financial issues. I think that falls in line with what you said earlier about letting a child keep their innocence and letting a kid be a kid.
Yes.
And not having to expose them to something that, although it will impact them, it's no fault to their own. And they may not be emotionally ready to deal with those types of things. So I can see in a situation, I can see a number of situations where you would want to lie to protect your child from one thing or another.
Yeah, but that can also backfire, right?
Yeah, it can.
I think also you lie to your children, right? Like to protect them. But then also at the same time, it's always like, oh, you lie to them to build a sense of confidence or something that isn't really quite there. Like, oh, yeah, you want to be, a Major League Baseball player and, they can't even swing a bat. You're kind of always.
Yeah, so let's.
Is that really protection or would you categorize that as something else?
So let's get into the next topic thing, because that's what we're going to cover. And that's essentially, can lying have an impact on your child? And depending on what it is, and again, depending on, the age and the stage of development, you want to be very careful because there can be some short and long-term effects from lying to your child, right? In the short term, when you talk about fostering creativity, telling a lie to your child when you're talking about some of these different fantasy things, it can actually do that. I talked about earlier, it instilling a sense of adventure, and it can actually create memorable experiences. But again, there are limits to all of this stuff. When we talked earlier a little bit about lying to protect, when you lie to protect your kid on the positive side, and right now I'm covering all these positive sides, you can provide comfort in a situation that would be uncomfortable, right? You can provide a sense of security in a situation, particularly if there's something that's bad going on. And again, the child may not understand what's going on, and you may lie to that child. So to keep them calm, to keep them in a sense of ease. And at the same time, you mentioned this earlier, you're working to preserve their innocence and maintain their emotional well-being. And now all that stuff is good in the short term, but lying to your child can have long-term effects. And again, everyone is different, so every situation is different, right? But when you're in a situation where you're constantly lying to your child, there is going to be an erosion of trust.
Mm-hmm.
Because, it's one thing to say, okay, well, Santa Claus is real, right?
Yep.
Depending on the age and development of that child, you'll be able to do that for a certain amount of time. But if you're saying Santa Claus is real, blue is green, you know what I mean? On is off and all those things, that trust is going to be eroded, because eventually the child is going to know that the things that you're saying aren't true, but you continue to actually say those things. And at the same time, they're going to be confused because, again, taking into their age and where they are from a development perspective, if you're telling them all these things that aren't true, and they're hearing things from other people that are saying or contradicting what you're saying, it's just going to confuse them.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, that, and I feel like when you're doing it from a sense of motivation too. So to your point, like, oh, well, if you're bad, you're going to end up on the naughty list. And say the kid has been bad all year. What do you do then? Do you really not get them a gift, or are you going to cave?
you got to follow through.
Right?
You got to follow through.
You know what I mean? Because then at that point, then they also start not believing it. Oh, well, there must be different levels to naughty. I'm not that naughty. My parents only tell me every day, but apparently it wasn't naughty enough to end up on the naughty list.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of valuable lessons that you could be missing the opportunity to teach your child when, you're in a situation where you're not being truthful with them. Again, I think the age and the stage of development that your child is in plays a big role in that, right? Going back to the whole confusion and mistrust, when you provide inconsistent information over time, the child's going to become skeptical about everything that you actually say. And part of that is what you just said. If you say, okay, well, you're going to be on a naughty list, you're on a naughty list, and this kid is getting gifts at the end of the year. Okay, well, you said I was going to be on a naughty list. I was naughty.
Right.
There's no consequences to that. You're inconsistent. Right. I can't believe anything that you're actually going to say. Mm-hmm. So,
well, that, and then where I was going with the earlier piece regarding motivation, I feel like parents do kind of pump up their kid, I guess, to help motivate them. Like, they essentially lie to them. Oh, you did a phenomenal job doing X, when they really didn't. You know what I mean? You're kind of gassing them up, actually, for lack of a better term, on their abilities. And then these kids go out into the real world and they truly do not have those abilities.
Yeah, I mean,
you know what I mean?
You got to find ways to build confidence in your children.
So, like, what does that do then?
I think, at all times, you got to make sure that you're grounded in reality when you start talking about confidence. Because again, it's just that you said, when they go out in the real world, if they think they're world beaters, they're going to be in for a shock when reality hits.
Right. Like, you don't want to box them. You don't want them to think that if they don't try hard that they can't succeed and be what they want to be. But to the point, there has to be some reality to it. You know what I mean? I don't know. I feel like that's another dicey one that you really have to toe the line on, trying to build their confidence, trying to motivate them. But at the same time, you can't do it too much in which
there's a way to actually
do it. There's like a false sense of confidence.
Yeah, I mean, there's a way to do it. And you got to focus on their strengths. If they're weak in something, listen, not everybody's strong in this, but you know what? You color in the lines very, very well.
Right.
The other thing that going back to how lying can have an impact, particularly if you do it consistently, is you can start to breed a deceptive, or they can start to develop deceptive tendencies as a kid, because kids model what they observe. And if your child begins to see that you're constantly inconsistent, well, that's what I'm going to use instead of telling lies. You're constantly inconsistent. They may believe it's okay for them to be constantly inconsistent.
Yeah.
And now they start to develop a deceptive mindset unknowingly, because to them, it's normal. So that's one thing you got to be careful of too. Well,
that's funny that you say that, because it might not even be lying to your kids. It could be lying in front of your kids. And your kid knows that you're lying. I feel like that's very, we'll call it inconsistent deception.
True. Well, I make it a habit not to lie in front of my kids. I just lie to them.
Right.
That way I can control.
But, you're being all sweet and whatever to so-and-so, I don't know, person X. But then you're talking a whole bunch of smack about them behind their back. You know what I mean? So I think, to your point, like, kids are going to see that, and also mimic you, right? And they might
Yeah.
start doing the same thing. So I don't even think it's just lying to your kids. It's also lying in
Well,
front
I
of
agree,
them.
but we're talking about lying to your kids.
No,
so we're
I
gonna
know,
stick-
but
yeah.
I just feel like it's very similar. I think topic wise and approach wise of the effects that it can have on a child.
Yeah, from the perspective of observing, you want to be mindful of what it is that you're doing in front of your kids. But we're gonna focus on you lying to your kids that you do all the time, like you said a little while ago. Stop lying to your kids. They're old enough now that you should be telling them the truth.
I don't think I actually lie to my kids, but that's
Well, in the beginning, you said I do it all the time.
I know. Well, I was lying.
When we talk about lying to kids from the perspective of trying to provide them protection, the one thing that we want to be mindful of is when kids go through adversity, just like other people, they begin to develop skills to actually help them deal with those things.
Mm-hmm.
They develop coping skills, they develop critical thinking skills. And if we continue to lie to them to protect them from these things, then it hinders the ability for them to begin developing those skills. And that's why I say, when you talk about lying to your kids, you want to take into account how old they are and what stage of development they're in, because you don't want to hinder their ability to be able to deal with adversity as they begin to get older and they're going to face more and more adversity.
No, agreed. You have to let them grow. I think you just need to be there and support them in their growth, and not let them do anything stupid. But at the same time, they definitely have to learn how to cope with things on their own.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that too is being honest with them and being open with them when you communicate, because that's another part. Honesty and communication, that helps to develop, critical thinking skills. And when they're presented with a situation where they need that skill, that's another one that they'll have in the bag. And I said this earlier too. You want to be mindful of preventing them with opportunities to learn when you're trying to lie to protect them, right? And I'm focusing on the lying to protect because the magic, the faith in the world, eventually as they get older, they're going to see what reality has in store for them.
Right.
The protection is something that I think all parents do. But again, we want to make sure that they're presented, or when they're presented with adversity or when they're presented with other opportunities, they have the ability to learn from those opportunities or those issues. And if they don't come across those, then they're not going to have that opportunity, and you're essentially robbing them of those opportunities to learn.
Yeah, no, definitely. It makes me just think of particularly of Shayna when she started questioning Santa.
Well, I'm not going to get into Shayna questioning Santa. I'm going to get into Shayna actually telling other people's kids that Santa wasn't real.
I think she did that one on accident, but
Nah, I came right out. I mean, Santa ain't real.
Shayna's, when she was younger, was a little truthful
I love you, Shayna.
at times. But well, and then to your point, how do you help your children grow and learn from those experiences? And that's why I'm specifically thinking about Shayna, because she flat out asked if Santa was real. And to the point,
I remember how I answered that question.
I don't remember how you answered. I remember how I answered it, but maybe she asked us at different times to see what each one's response was. But, it's right there, you had the choice to either continue with the lie or just flat out tell her that it's not real. So, what did you do?
What I said was, sometimes the things that you believe in don't have to be grounded in reality. It was something to that extent.
Yeah.
And I also said, it's more about the idea than the actual person.
Okay. I feel like that was more of my response to Ayla, but to Shayna at the time.
Ayla came out and said her teacher told her Santa Claus wasn't real.
Right.
By that time, I tried that approach, but she said her teacher said it wasn't real.
Right. For Shayna, she's particularly said that the kids at school were saying Santa wasn't real.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so then I asked her, I said, well, what is it that you think? I said, because, people aren't always going to think the same. She's like, well, I still think he's real. And I'm like, well, then there you go.
I used the Polar Express with Ayla a few years earlier. I was like, on the Polar Express, not everybody can hit a bell. Mm-hmm. She's like, yeah, I said, some people don't believe.
Yeah.
I said, if you believe, you'll hit a bell. You know what I mean? I think at some point, too, it came down to she realized, okay, well, you know what? If I believe, I'm going to get that extra gift. I'm going to get that gift. Because, we don't, for Christmas, all the gifts didn't come from Santa Claus. Only one gift did.
Yes.
The gifts came from us. So.
Well, yeah, dang it. We're going to get credit for those suckers.
Yeah.
Not this imaginary roly-poly looking guy.
Yeah. So just for this section, the last thing that I'll talk about when we talk about possible consequences for lying to your kid, you got to think about the impact that lying can have on their relationships, not just yours, but again, other relationships that they begin to develop. Because if we talk about kids now mimicking what they observed, and you're in a situation where you've been lying to your kids. And again, there are some white lies or some fantasy lies that when they're young, it's okay. And from my perspective, to engage in. Mm-hmm. But at some point, when the cat's out the bag, the cat's out the bag. And you want to keep in mind that what you're doing at some point may and probably will be mimicked by your child. And then when they start lying to other individuals outside of the household, it can have a negative impact on those relationships, because then they'll be looked at as being untruthful and liars.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then like you said too, the coping situation is, I think, the biggest impact. If you're just constantly telling your kids, like, take divorce, for instance, parents are always yelling at each other every day and they feel like something's off. And then you're just constantly telling them everything's fine, everything's fine, everything's fine. They're not going to learn how to deal with situations either. Well, they could potentially not learn how to deal with situations either. They're just going to constantly tell everybody everything's fine, when even though they know deep down inside, everything is not fine.
And at the same time, they will look at that and think of it as normal. So it'll be normalcy for them. And then, you're also, outside of just lying to them, you're teaching them that interaction is okay. It's normal, which is not something that you want to actually do. Right.
So if you're on, I feel like you have to give your kids some form of truth. Maybe not go and just jump off the cliff and just tell them everything. But at least, I feel like kids can also deal fine with
certain things. Yeah.
No, not just even certain things, but like small responses. You know what I mean? Well, Ayla always asks the why like 10 times over. But, some kids you can just say, Daddy and I are working things out. We're trying to work things out. And they're fine with that. They don't even care how you're trying to work it out, what you're working out. Like, they won't ask any questions. But because you gave them an answer, they're like, oh, okay. And they'll go off.
Yeah, there's some considerations you should take into account before lying to your child, right? I've said this multiple times about the age and development stage. Younger kids are more accepting to, simplified answers. But as they get older, you're going to have to start beginning to tell the truth. So you want to gradually start beginning to bring in those pieces that explain what it is you've been doing all this time. So gradual truth revealing is something that, you should consider once your kid starts to hit a certain age and they start to develop and they start to have more time out in the world. Mm-hmm. Which means you have to start being more realistic about what it is that you're actually saying to them. Yeah. And go ahead.
I was going to say, they're going to find out regardless. Like, how in the real world they're exposed to a lot more.
100%. And that leads me to that last point where you have to start developing honest and open communication with them as they begin to actually grow and mature. You want to foster an environment where it's okay for them to ask questions, and you being okay with giving them the actual answers that you need to give them. There's nothing that says you have to give them the whole truth, nothing but the truth.
Right.
But when you start to have those conversations and you start to build, that rapport, you'll know how much you can actually give to them in one set amount of time. And at some point, the communication will be completely open and you can be completely honest and say, yeah, nah, that shit ain't real. I lied to you about that all the time. But here's why I lied to you.
Well, it's funny because when you were going, like, give it to them, I was going to say, get away with.
You get away with?
Like, how much truth can you get away with? Like, just giving them, like, first start with just simple, basic answers. See if you can get away with that.
Yeah, that's that gradual. Yeah, that's that gradual part. Listen.
Right? Blank.
Did you lie? Yes. They say, cool, walk away. Walk away. You know what I mean?
Right.
You don't have to give them everything. But,
right. Exactly.
As a parent, we have certain responsibilities to our children. And in the act of carrying out those responsibilities, sometimes we want to maintain their innocence and magic. And so we end up not giving them the whole truth. Let's call a spade a spade. Sometimes we end up lying to them. Now, it's not always a bad thing. You could have a particular reason why you're doing it. But when we start talking about whether or not it's okay to lie to our children, again, I'm going to say this because it's going to sound like I'm beating a dead horse. You have to take into account the age and that stage of development in which they're at. And also, what is the reason that you might possibly be lying to them? If you're trying to protect your child, if you're trying to maintain a sense of wonder in their innocence, then there are going to be situations where I think it's okay to lie to your children. And that's recorded, and I actually said it.
Yeah, well, if they're like 2 or 3, they're not even going to remember.
Well, I mean, listen, hopefully they won't. Hopefully they won't. But at the same time, at some point you're going to reach that age where you want to begin to start nurturing a trusting relationship with your kids, or otherwise you can run into some very, very troublesome issues down the road while you're parenting.
Agreed.
Now, we end every show off the same way every episode. And it's about reflecting on the week that's passed. It's time for my weekly reflection. Sometimes I have a problem saying some particular words.
Just speaking?
Just speaking? No, I don't have time. I don't have a problem speaking some words. This week, I want to talk about happiness. Happiness is not a destination. Sometimes we're in a situation where we look at something, if I had this, I'll be happy. If I did this, I'll be happy. When you get there or you achieve those things, 9 times out of 10, okay, well, you're happy momentarily, but it doesn't last. What I'm trying to say is the result of your daily choices is what leads to happiness. So if you want to be happy, the key is be grateful, be kind, have a positive attitude daily, and that is going to be key on your journey to reaching happiness. That being said, thank you for joining the Lunch with Sandy podcast. Be sure to follow and leave feedback on your favorite podcasting app. Until next time, stay well.
That's it for this week's episode of the Lunch with Sandy podcast. Thanks for listening. We'd love to hear your feedback and comments on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Lunch with Sandy. And be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast app. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to rate and review us. Thanks again for listening to the Lunch with Sandy podcast.